this, like days after each other. It's like, oh, you thought that was crazy? Wait till you see what I'm about to do. I just sent all these plagues and then delivered you out of that. I just separated a sea. You walked through it, and then the sea came back together because I told him to hit it with a staff, and it parts. Right? Oh, that wasn't good. I turned water that was bitter. I made it sweet for you. Oh, that was, like, it's just manna from heaven. When does bread fall from heaven? Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Right? God has done the miraculous again and again and again. And so my assumption would be the people of Israel at this point are like, what do you want to do, God? Right? Like, at that point, I feel like in my life, I'd be, God, whatever you say, I'm all in. You've done some crazy things. It's been a wild past 2 weeks. I'm in. Whatever that is, right? Like, just do one thing, right? We were told a story of one thing this morning. You just feel the room was like, let's go. Like, let's charge out. Let's go pray for some people. Let's do some things. Like, you just told me a story to see it. Like, how crazy is that? But I think in us, right? So we take for granted some of these things that I think it can be also easy when we start reading these stories, think, oh, I wouldn't respond like that. But how quickly we can find ourselves in those positions. How quickly we truly are. And if, oh, God did God really do that? Like, I don't know, that was pretty crazy, but maybe that bread maybe the baker was throwing it over the tent, right? Like, I don't know, like, we just find ways to rationalize these things. But again, to take us where we are, our assumption might be, the people of Israel are like ready to do what God asks for them at this point in the Exodus. So we'll pick up chapter 17, verse 1. So the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. And they camped near Rephidim. Jarrett, you can correct that. But there was no water for the people to drink. We've seen this before, right? There's no water to drink. This should be easy. We've literally did this just a little bit ago. So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? Quarrel is a generous way of saying these people are angry. They're fighting, they're yelling, they're quarreling, they're arguing, and they're starting to get not just it. The other thing in this story is as they're challenging Moses, right? That's also their way, that's their proxy to challenge God. Right? So when we talk, it's not often we say the people yelled at God, but they yell at Moses all the time. And Moses is standing in the place of the intermediary for them. So that's them challenging God, and that's not a hidden thing to them. Right? So when they quarrel amongst each other, they're quarreling with Moses, and he says, why do you put God to the test? There's an understanding that when you challenge God's anointed, right, and we see this with the kings later on, it is tantamount, and they understand it's challenging God as well. And so they have clearly not changed very much, right? We saw them provide water. Why are we so quick to turn back? And so here's our first question. That is, like we said, what do we believe we deserve? Here's how I'd reword that for you tonight. Do we believe we deserve God's provision? Do we believe that we deserve God's provision? Do you believe that you are owed God's provision? Is another way. Do I think God owes me something? See, because like I said, I would expect the people of Israelites, when they face difficulty, they would expect that God's going to do something special. He's done it every other time. Man, God has proved he loves us. God's proved he's providing for us. I can't wait to see how he's going to do it this time. Right? That's what I would think. But instead of an attitude of trust, they come in and they express an attitude of entitlement. They start to quarrel. They start to challenge. They start to wrestle, get angry, yell. Right? They express They express an attitude of entitlement by demanding water. There's no humility in this. There's no coming and saying, God, we have nothing. We're trusting you. Would you meet us here? Right? That's not the first response. It's not the first response to say, what have we missed, God? Did we make a move you didn't call us to? It's simply to go on the attack. There's no water. You don't care about us. You don't love us, right? You have led us here to die. What have you led us out here to die? Right? They're entitled. There's no humility in their response. And they express entitlement also by complaining. They're so ungrateful for what they had that God owed them something. What you've given us, what you've led us to, what you've done for us in the past isn't enough. You still owe us provision. Right? So tonight, my question again for you, and our question, and this is meant to just challenge us a little bit, also encourage us. Encourage me as I walk forward in my life. How do I respond to God? Do I believe that I'm entitled to provision? Do we walk in our lives believing that God owes us provision, whatever that provision looks like? Do I think he owes me anything? Well, I did my part. I showed up to church on Sunday, and I've done my nighttime prayers with my family, and I've even been pretty solid on my tithes this year. You owe me success in my business ventures. You owe me success in, my relationships with my kids, my marriage. I've done my part, and so now you had better, what, did I do all of that? And I start to get challenging with God. And challenging God, God's not afraid of that. God's not afraid of me to bring those things, but my attitude in that shows where I'm at. Doesn't mean he's not even going to move in those things, but it encourages me to look at myself and say, the things I'm bringing to God are fine. I am fine to bring to God the fact that we don't have water here. That's an accurate assessment of a situation. However, when I come to God, I can do it two ways. I can do it in entitlement, or I can do it in trust. I would rather do it in trust, in the excitement of God. I'm doing everything I know to do. I need you to show up. How are you going to show up? What are you going to do? Rather than you owe me to show up. Right? If we find ourselves with a sense of entitlement, how do we combat that? Colossians chapter 3, verse 12 through 17. We're going to have some of these. You can go to these verses. We always encourage you to look at these ones. We're going to see these in the Bible. But for our sake, I'm going to leave my Bible in Exodus chapter 17, so we're not back and forthing all the time. I'm going to read this one off the screen, right? But here it says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. How do we how do we combat a sense of entitlement? First thing, you can leave that up on the screen there, Cam, for a second. First thing, right, is let peace rule. I don't need to be worried about entitlement. If I've got peace, if I operate in peace, if I walk in peace and say, just like, man, God, I'm trusting you. I don't have to be entitled. I start to get entitled when I start to let anxiety and worry run my life, because now all of a sudden when things aren't coming exactly in the plan I had, I start to feel like I'm owed something. I put the things in the formula, and that entitlement starts to run out. I get anxious, right? But then we clothe ourselves in kindness, compassion, humility, all of those things. But the other thing I want to encourage you right here is this. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. I think this is one of the greatest things we can do to combat entitlement. There it is. Entitlement. When we forgive people, it is the greatest expression, right? Especially when it's done in love, right? When my love for you means I'm forgiving you, it is the greatest expression I know of that which is owed is not important, right? Whatever I was wronged and whatever I am now owed to right that wrong, whether or not it be an apology or anything else, when I wipe that slate clean, I consistently set in my life an example of what is owed and what is right and just is not actually what matters most. I love justice. God loves justice. But it's not up to me to bring justice. It's up to me. I forgive you. Our slate is wiped clean. Now you can still come, that person can still come and apologize, and we can walk through that process and it's gonna be great. But on my end, man, forgiveness. And when you do that, it is really difficult to be entitled to anything when I just walk through my life forgiving others in love, as God forgave me. So, as we continue on, right, we see the Israelites stepping in that. They've got a sense of entitlement. Now, the second question, right, what do we believe about God? Here's what we're going to look at in this one is, do we believe that God is good? What do we believe about God? Do we believe he's good, or do we not believe do we believe he's something else, maybe sometimes good, maybe kind of good? Or do we actually believe that he is just good? All right, you pick it up in verse 3. But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. And they said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Then Moses cried out to the Lord and said, what am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me. Right, so sometimes these questions it's like, that doesn't seem like too big of a deal. And so we're getting snapshots of what's happening. They're challenging Moses, AKA they're challenging God, right? They're questioning him, and Moses is going to God saying, they're ready to stone me. That should give you a feel for the temperature relationally that's happening right now. And they are angry. They're livid, right? And they're starting to look for somebody to blame in this, right? But again, we go back to their past. And it's so easy for us to look at our past and we start washing away. We encourage all of our students and in our life groups that I've always been a part of, we've always encouraged people to journal, right? Journal, and especially, it's always an interesting conversation, like, because we'll usually, in our life groups that have been married couples, right, we'll split the guys and girls for a portion of the night. And the guys will be talking, and I'll always bring up journals at some point. And usually I've got somebody else planted there who's ready to, like, really quickly give me, like, yeah, that's a great idea. Just so it's like, you get a little affirmation first. Now it's really hard for people to be like, no, that's dumb. But, like, we'll talk about it, and it's always so fun in a group of guys because there'll be, like, 10 guys and they're like, journal. What am I supposed to write? It's not a Dear Diary. It's like, no, I'm not talking about that. Like, journal, we write these things down because it is so easy, not only 2 years from now, but 2 weeks from now, to look back and just forget, right? Any of you that have kids, how many kids or stories of your kids have you forgotten that were so funny in the moment and so precious and so special, right? You just forget those things, not because they're not meaningful, not because they weren't real, but just time washes these things away, right, in our minds. So what do? There are things we can do to remember those things, to go into the past, like we journal. So sometimes I just open up a journal from when I was 17 years old. What was I praying about? And all of a sudden I start reading through it, and it's like, oh my gosh, that happened. God did that. I didn't even think about that. God did that 5 years later. Oh, I can't even believe I prayed. I prayed that my wife would be X, Y, and Z. And I didn't even remember I thought that at that time. And look at my wife now. Just these things that match up, we forget. We see that's why the Israelites all through the Old Testament, right? Anytime God really does something, they start building altars, right? So that as they move through, as they come through these areas, again, there's all these visual reminders of what God has done in the past. And so they've seen a bunch recently, right? God just did these things. He's always taken care of us. He has always, when we needed him to show up, he's always shown up, and showed up not just a little bit. It's not like we squeaked by. It's like, God, we're totally taken care of. When we're backed up against the Red Sea, we didn't make it out with 1/3 of our people, right? Like, God cleared the path for the entire nation to come out, right? They're protected. God didn't send enough manna, and you had to make tough decisions on who gets the first food, right? Who gets fed and who might not make it today. Like, he is always taking care of his people. So what do we believe about God? Do we believe he's good? Do the people of Israel in this time, as they're going through this, believe that God is good? See, Israel's sin doesn't stop with their sense of entitlement. It progressed to questioning God's goodness, who he is, who he promises to be, the nature of God. They question. And they question because it's just not going their way in a moment. Just for a quick moment. No matter how much God has done up to this point, this moment looks tough. And instead of even trusting for any amount of time or letting it play out, it's just quickly, right back. And they move to mocking God. Right? And mocking him in those questions. Again, sometimes when we read these things, it can be difficult, right? It's like when you text. Ever text your husband or wife or your kids or somebody, and it's like, that just came, I get a text back and it's like, that was really harsh. And you talk to the person later and they're like, oh, I was totally joking. I was like, I would love that conversation. It's like, dude, that's not what that read like. I was having a conversation with somebody very recently, and I was like, we need to soften up your text language. That was real direct, And I know you didn't mean anything by it, but that was like, that person was trying to help you out, and that was like a 3-word response. We got to add some fluff, man. We got to ease this out. So sometimes text can be difficult to read. The people of Israel, as they're questioning this, right, as they say, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? That's starting to get sarcastic. That's really coming at Moses, and again, not just at Moses, at God. Like, do you really bring us out here to die? Even though if that was the move, we could have done that like 5 times already, super easy, by not showing up. Right? They're attacking. They're mocking God. They're Again, they're just challenging his goodness. We don't believe you are really good. So for us, as we are reading through these stories, and we're not trying to put ourselves, I'm not trying to put us in the story. I'm not trying to say I am these things. I'm trying to learn from these things. I want to find what's happening here. Where in my life does it look like this? I'm not maybe the same situation there. I'm not backed up against a Red Sea with an army chasing me down, right? But in my difficult moments where I feel like I'm backed in a corner, how do I respond to God? When I face difficulties, when we face difficulties, it is easy to question God's goodness. Often, and this tends to be something of a, call it a flaw, if you will, in the modern church, is that oftentimes difficulty for us has moved to meaning God's angry with us, or there's some sin in my life that I'm being punished for. And now, it's not to say that sin does not have punishing consequences, that sin doesn't lead to, let's say, difficulty in difficult situations, right? There are consequences. I make a choice. I now have to live with the repercussions of that choice, right? But that's not God sitting there like, man, I'm punishing, like, have fun with this. This is going to be the worst. Like, hopefully, it's not like God bending me over and spanking. It's just, here are the outflows of that. I still love you. I still want to operate. But we have this mentality, right? And it starts near World War I, really bleeding in heavily to the church, right? You see C.S. Lewis write a book, The Problem of Pain. If you've never read it, an incredible book, great book. It's very short too, almost like a booklet, a pamphlet, but an incredible book, right, that I'll reference here just for a minute, because he brings up this idea that we're really, at that time, we're a couple generations in, but it was the first time a generation had ever questioned the fact that there's pain in our life. Up until that point, pain, death, sickness, that's nothing challenging the goodness of God. That's just what it is. This is what we deal with. All of a sudden, because of modern medicine, because of different revolutionary things that had all of a sudden changed our world, we're looking at it, and the idea has entered our mind that we shouldn't have to experience any of these things. Right? And that idea hadn't existed since the Garden of Eden, that pain, sin, and death, like that these things don't have natural outflows. All of a sudden, we have this issue of, well, if God's a good God, why is there pain in the world? Right? Why is there suffering? Why is there this? And so it's an incredible book. It's really great. It's helpful to think through those things. He does an excellent job bringing words to that. I've often had older students read that and then have discussions on it because I think it's good and thought-provoking. But there's something in the historic church and even as we are a convergent church and we really celebrate sacraments and certain liturgies and things like that, we find there's deep and rich history in those things that takes us out of the current moment of the world is crazy, and oh my goodness, all of this is happening, and that must mean that God is punishing us. And it doesn't leave the modern church, the charismatic, and the Protestant church doesn't have a lot of ability to wrestle with kind of that deep mystic side of things, the I don't understand it, but it just is there, right? God moves in that, even when it hurts, like God moves in that, which things like liturgy, things like sacramentalism, that really houses a lot of those elements. And so that's why it's one of the reasons it's so special to us. Because God's not punishing us for some unconfessed sin. And it's not time, I didn't stub my toe, or my wife didn't get sick, and all of a sudden I've got to go digging through my life, or what did I forget to confess? And God's just sitting up there like, all right, you better start guessing. So I got to start going through my prayer life. I'm sorry I did this. I'm sorry I did this. And he's like, no. Colder, warmer. Bingo, right? That's not how it works. Right, and again, like I said, while there's difficulty, and difficulty does come and come out of sin, and we have to walk through those things, more oftentimes it's because God's trying to show us something about us and something about him. Difficulty gives us a window into our hearts and into the heart of God in a way that, unfortunately, right, plenty just doesn't. Right, I learn more about myself in difficult struggles, right? When rubber meets the road, you see this. I've had guys go, I've had a couple of guys that I'm close with that gone high up in the military, and a couple of business guys, and all of them know, man, when you want to see somebody under pressure, right? I've always loved watching military stuff, the military channel, and like you watch the Navy SEAL training, you see Hell Week, and you see, what the Marines go through, and all these different, it's incredible, right? But the entire point of those drill sergeants yelling at people all the time is, I have got to see how you respond under pressure, because there is something different about you under pressure. I see more about you in struggle than I ever will when we're just having a great time. Man, yeah, it's easy to be kumbaya and to have the camaraderie sitting around a barbecue and beach chairs. But tell me how you are when the rubber meets the road. In my marriage, it's so easy to love my wife when we're on a cruise. Oh, this is so much fun, right? We're kicked back on the beach. We're having a great time. Somebody's watching the kids. This is incredible. There's a movie. Or it's like, oh, my goodness, this is so wonderful. Right? So easy not to fight right then. But tell me how you are like 4 days into a terrible work week when the kids are screaming. And now how am I treating my wife? That shows me more about me. Right? So God, that to say these difficulties